for having me here. I'm excited just to hang out and share a little bit. In talking with the leadership team and kind of figure out to share a little bit about my life, and then kind of give me a few talking points for where to go regarding inspiration inside of desolation, kind of reflective of this current time. So if you're cool with that, we'll go that way. If you have any questions or something, feel free, I don't know, throw it in the chat or something like that. And if someone on the team can maybe field that, that would be awesome. And I don't mind you interrupting me if you feel the question is relevant to where we're going, feel free to interrupt or whatever. If you're just wondering about like whether In and Out is better than Five Guys, like we know it's In and Out, so we don't need to field those kind of questions. You know what I mean? I know those you on the East Coast, you're kind of left out on that. So we're going to pray for your salvation. One day you will experience the glory of In and Out. But that being said, let's jump right in. Like I was mentioning, I work for a company called Life Team. It's a national Catholic youth ministry organization, and we serve parishes. We try to serve a lot of just direct-to-teen ministry through online and digital means, and then we also host a lot of training conferences for people who work in the church. We host a lot of conferences for teens in the church, and basically our hope is just to figure out every way possible to lead a teenager closer to Christ. And design and marketing and creative is a huge part of that. But for me, I never set out to work in a creative field at all. I never really considered that. I'm a youth minister. I was a youth minister for about 14 years. Growing up, I was always into creative things, but I never really had thought about it as some sort of career. And granted, I'm probably like a few days older than most of you. And so like we probably grew up in slightly different generations. And so growing up like without the internet and without that kind of stuff, like you weren't really exposed to maybe the wide world in the way that some of you maybe are growing up and exposed to it now. And so the idea of what I could do with my life was probably pretty limited based upon that. And so because of that, I started going to school to become a teacher. Both of my parents are teachers, kind of figured it was something I could do so that I could focus on ministry on the side, like on the weekends at my local church and stuff. And ultimately, through God's grace and some time, I ended up working as a youth minister, jumped into a full-time position. And ultimately, it took me to Orange County, California, and I was working at a parish here in Orange County. And I realized my creative kind of instincts as a child, like I used to draw comic books, I used to record little skits and things. All of that kind of started to resurface when I was here in Orange County, because all of a sudden I realized I was in a place to do ministry, and my number one job was to tell these teens about just the love of Jesus. But the biggest hurdle for that is getting them in the building so you can actually have that conversation. And so it was pressed upon my heart very, very heavily that like I need to figure out a way to kind of throw my hat in the ring to get their attention. They weren't going to just give me their attention. It wasn't something they owed me. Why should they listen to me? I'm just some kind of old dude standing at the pulpit talking to them. So I had to figure out a way that would kind of catch their eye or show that this is worth them coming and maybe coming to this youth night or having a conversation or something. And here in Orange County, like where I was ministering, it was a very wealthy area. And so they had generally the families of the parish had a fair amount of money. And because the teens had a lot of money, then they had a lot of opportunity to go and do things. And here in Orange County, I mean, you go maybe 15, 20 minutes in any direction and you're going to have some of the coolest beaches in the world. You're going to have Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm. You have some of the craziest malls. Like there's a ton of entertainment around here. There's a ton of options to fill your life with. And when you have money to do that, like it's pretty easy just to kind of bounce from entertainment to entertainment and sort of consume that. And I realized as a church or as a ministry, I needed to immediately look culturally relevant to begin to get their attention so that I could have a conversation or invite them to a youth night. And that was ultimately where I started learning about design. Like I said, I had an instinct growing up, but it wasn't anything I ever pursued and never went to school for it. I think I'm a little bit obsessive by nature. And so once I realized how important design is, whether it's a flyer or like a shirt for a retreat or something going in the bulletin or whatever, I just started scouring YouTube and just watching tutorials, seeing the things that I liked, and then watching people explain how to design it like that. And I think like this day and age that we live in right now is remarkable because you can pretty much learn anything you want. You don't need the permission of a teacher or the permission of a degree or even the permission of a paycheck to do it. Like if you have a desire and you find it online, like through Skillshare or Google or YouTube or just something, you can learn whatever you want. And I think it's a beautiful kind of era that we're in to be able to do that. And so I just kind of obsessively up till 3-4 in the morning, just chewing through tutorials, trying to understand Photoshop, trying to understand Illustrator. Now, I remember when I first started Illustrator, someone was mentioned about the pen tool a little bit earlier. I used to have nightmares about the pen tool. I would literally sleep and I would see like these dots and I couldn't get them to connect. I couldn't get the right curve. I was going nuts. And my wife didn't understand it at the time. And she still doesn't, but that's okay. But I just remember like I was so consumed by it. I was kind of obsessive. And ultimately, that's what got me to design. I started designing for my own parish. And then neighboring churches were like, oh, that's a cool shirt. Where'd you get it? And I was like, well, I made it for our youth group. And then they asked me to do some work for them. And it kind of spread like that. And then eventually, some of the awesome people at Life Team reached out to me to do some freelance work. And then they had offered a position to me to join them doing design. And I didn't accept it. I waited about another 2 years because I was just focused on doing youth ministry. To me, design wasn't something I wanted to do as a career. Design was a necessity for reaching people with the gospel, because we live in a very aesthetically driven world, especially nowadays and age. And so the idea of art and beauty and catching someone's attention was crucially important to my ministry. And so that's why I was designing. It wasn't anything I really thought of doing separately or kind of splitting from my ministry at the church and following a career in design. Ultimately, God kind of led us down that route. And I've been with Life Team now for a little over 6 years. And it's been really cool. I started just doing graphic design, and then kind of worked through and moved into becoming the director of creative and marketing. And so my job now is awesome because I just get to hire really, really talented people and help try to make sure they have what they need to do their job. And I've literally the people that I've been able to bring on and kind of surround myself with at Life Team, they're some of the most creative people I've encountered in and out of the church. We have just amazing illustrators and designers, just marketing minds. And so it's really cool just to kind of have that network of people for me to just kind of soak in and figure out how do I support them, and then just kind of like let them loose and see what they turn out, and just they do amazing work. And so I feel very blessed to be a part of it. And I'm glad God brought me here. I see how important design and creativity is for the world and in ministry. But I never would have pictured that, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago when I was first starting out in ministry and stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of me in a nutshell. I should add to that, I am married. I have a beautiful wife. Her name is Brittany. And we have a 3-year-old son. His name's Judah. And he's a wild man. He's fantastic. He's super creative though too, which is really cool just to see maybe the innate creativity in human beings. Sometimes I think creativity is like learned out of us, or we're convinced that we're not creative unless we are, become like an artist officially, or if we call ourselves a creative. And I even struggle with some of those terminologies, I think, because the reality is like, I don't think anyone is a creative in the sense that I don't think anyone is not a creative. I think everyone is creative by nature. We image the creative God. And I think maybe sometimes we've compartmentalized what creative means. And maybe in doing that, we've sort of truncated or boxed in people's ability to create and express in a way that maybe it's fears or maybe it's popular trends or whatever. And so I don't know, it's kind of cool to see my son. I try to encourage it as much as I can, whether he's playing with Play-Doh or Legos or the dog, like just to just be creative and encourage him. And he brings stuff to me. I have no idea what it is, but man, I make a big deal out of it. Like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, man. What is it? But I just want him to know, like, he's creative and he was made that way. And it doesn't matter if I get it or not, like, you go be creative, little man. And so, yeah, I don't know. I love what I'm doing. I love my life, and I'm excited to be here. In terms of the topic, if there are any questions, feel free. Again, I'm not really looking at chat, but someone on the team, just feel free to interrupt. You can, like I said, just mute me, so I'll shut up, and then you can tell me that I need to answer a question. I'm good with it. But in terms of the topic right now, I was given this prompt of inspiration in desolation. or we talk about isolation, right? And I really want to focus on inspiration, but before I go there, that's going to be the meat and potatoes. I want to touch on desolation or isolation uh, real quickly. I find it fascinating. Like, one of my favorite books of the Bible is the book of Genesis, and specifically the first couple chapters of it, where it deals with the creation story. And I love right off the bat, we see that God is creative and that God creates out of chaos, out of nothing, and he brings this like beautiful just life forward. But one of the things, and this is what I want to point out, is if you remember, if you've never read it, read the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you're going to find two different accounts of creation, and they're sort of meant to be this ancient Hebrew poetry that convey the truths of a creative God. So it's not a science book, it's not meant to be a textbook like that, but it's conveying these eternal truths through these stories of creation we read in a very poetic way in the ancient Hebrew dialect. But you find in there, God creates man, God creates Adam, right? There's a distinction. I'm not going to get into like a gender war. It's not a guys versus girls, or who came first, or who ate the tree, or the fruit, and who caused sin, Eve, woman. I'm not going to get into all that separation. We'll let you can chew on that. But I want to point out, God created singularly one person. Before Eve came along, before civilization started to kind of happen, right, from Adam and Eve and the families and that kind of thing, just one person. He creates Adam. And then in Genesis, he tells them, it says, then the Lord God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and to care for it. I love that this is the first action, right? God creates man and he says, I have a work for you to do. Cultivate means the work of your hands. And I think as creatives, though our mediums, especially nowadays, have adapted to more of a digital means in many ways, it's still that very manual work of our hands idea, right? And he says, he placed it in the garden to cultivate it. So in other words, God is inviting Adam singularly into the work of creation, to begin to till and create alongside God in this beautiful masterpiece God was setting forward. And then it goes on to say that he recognized it's not good that man should be alone. And then it says that God started creating all the animals. And I love this. Read this in Genesis chapter 2, around verse 18 or 19. He creates the wild animals. And he says, then he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called each living creature was then its name. I don't know about you, this blows my mind. The God of the universe is so humble and so desiring to co-labor or co-create with mankind that he creates, only in the mind of God, these crazy animals, right? Like a horse, a giraffe, a duckbill platypus, right? And he brings it to man. And he says, join me in this process. Whatever you name this thing will be what it is. God brings man singularly, single person, into this moment of creation and says, I want you to cultivate it. I want you to work with me. I want you to name things with me in this moment. And I love it because all of this is done before the rest of the world comes along and the rest of the people. St. John Paul II calls this time with God, where it's just one person and God, he calls it solidarity, or the original solitude. And I think solitude is really what God is inviting us into in this quarantine time. We take isolation and we're alone and we're in prison. But see, with God, we're never alone and we're never isolated. We're in solitude, this original solitude where we can just lean into God and the singular person, me. And in this moment, there's something he's creating in my life that he's calling me to join him with, to cultivate, to work with him in. And maybe that's just patience. Maybe that's trust. Maybe that's learning how to love from a distance. Maybe that's trying to figure out new ways to connect with family. Maybe it's just the humility of following orders when someone says, it's better if you stay in your house right now, right? Like, God's cultivating and calling us into it singularly. I love this at the very start of creation. And I think for us right now, we have the opportunity to lean into that again. Okay, I went too far on that. So forgive me, Ricky, if I go over time, you just deal with it. No, don't. You can cut me off. But I want to talk about inspiration right now. Desolation, isolation, solitude is what we just talked about. But inspiration. I think for me, in kind of looking at society now and kind of praying through this, I think inspiration is a word that we can kind of get mixed up sometimes. And by that, I mean, we have this temptation that comes with this word inspiration. And I think for me, I've identified it in two ways. We can be inspired by someone, or we can be inspired for someone. And this is the way I would phrase it. And I want to explain what I mean by that. We can be inspired by someone or inspired for someone. And by inspired by someone, I would equate that to, we see something creative that someone else did. It could be a song, it could be a painting, or whatever it may be. And we see it and we receive it. And in receiving it, it sort of generates these ideas in us, or it makes us think about certain things, or maybe brings back memories or stirs, certain vibes within us. And from that place, we are inspired to then create something on our own. That's to be inspired by someone. But to be inspired for someone is when we see what someone likes or what a group of someone likes, and then we create with the end goal of hoping they will like it. And I think there's a big difference here. To be inspired by someone means that you see their work and how they've cultivated their craft, and you let it move you, and then you create from that place. But when we're inspired for someone, we actually create solely for their approval. And this means that we can never truly be the full essence of how creative we are called to be, because our creativity or our effort in all of our mediums are done to please someone else, to get the thumbs up, to get the share, to get the like. And we're not actually creating from a place of authenticity. And I'm not sure if this makes sense. If it makes sense, throw like a thumbs up emoji or something. If it doesn't, you can put a thumbs down. Okay, good. I think this is where it comes from, though. Like, we live in a culture that is pushing this constant consumption of content. And if we're talking about being inspired by someone versus being inspired for someone, or you could say moved by someone or moved for someone, we got to understand one is a response to being given something. You've given me this movement with your music, and I'm responding to that movement through my design. Or on the other hand, one is an attempt to get something. I'm going to do this so you will affirm me. I'm going to do this so you will share my content. I'm going to do this so I'll get more followers, right? And one of those is healthy, and one of those is, I would say, the freest place that art can stream from. The other one, I think, is imprisonment. The other one is allowing someone else to cuff your hands and dictate what you're painting and where your brushstrokes go. But it comes because we live in this culture that is so content obsessed. And I'm not saying content is bad, but I think there's something to this. If we have essentially a never-ending stream of content coming at us, we very easily become consumers with that content. And a consumer is something far different than a creator. A consumer is far different than actually someone who maybe meditates or sits with. I don't mean to be crass here, but this is the analogy that comes to mind, so I'll do my best to share it. The difference of what I'm talking about, a consumer for just massive amounts of content versus someone who actually sits and allows themselves to be moved by a single piece of work, is the difference between marriage and prostitution, right? Like marriage, you sit in this relationship through good and bad, and it moves you, and you move this person, and you work together, and there's this vulnerability. Oh, but prostitution is just an objectifying of a person for what they do for you in that moment. And I think in a content-driven lifestyle, we can become very, very connected or inspired or moved by this idea of content and the likes and the approval. And so all of a sudden we find ourselves creating not from authentic inspiration, but we create so we can fit someone else's mold. We create so we can beat the algorithm. We create so we can get more followers. And ultimately we sell ourselves and our creative ability short. And in thinking about this difference, I want you to ask yourself, maybe this would help to understand the difference of being inspired by versus being inspired for. If no one ever saw your art, would you create? Better yet, if no one actually liked your art, would you create? In other words, you created something and you vulnerably put it out on Instagram and you got a big old fat 0 likes on that. But that was a product of you, of your inspiration. Would you create? Or do you change your methods because you want to like? I'm a victim of the, I struggle with this myself. This is something that I literally legitimately have to kind of sit through and kind of ask myself, like, why am I creating? And I'll be very, very clear here too. This is a small side note. What I'm talking about right now is what I would deem to be the purest form of art, or maybe like art from the artist's say, like expression. When we're in jobs and in different like businesses and stuff, obviously there's a role of that business. And so as artists, we are brought in to then adopt the role of that business with our art. So I hope you can understand. I'm not just talking about like, well, I work for a company and we're supposed to make apparel, but I make my own thing and no one buys it, but screw that if they fire me. Like, that's not what I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about like you as an artist and what you love to do. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you're inspired by someone or something? Or are you doing it because you're hoping to get something from someone or something? Those are two different reasons why we create. And one of those, I think, is authentic freedom and actually cultivating what God has invited us into. Some of you, I hope you're familiar with John Bellion, this musician. He's freaking awesome. He just dropped on Twitter yesterday, I think it was yesterday, a little sample of a new song. And I wanted to share just the lyric because I think it's very appropriate to what this idea that I'm talking about, inspiration and content. He says this, he says, "Content is not king. Coretta Scott King was not TikToking. Don't ever shoot a dance to this. This is a effing manuscript." Oh, one more time. Content is not king. Coretta Scott King was not TikToking. Don't ever shoot a dance to this. This is not an effing manuscript. Or this is an effing manuscript. I'm gonna break it down. Coretta Scott King, the civil rights activist, wife of Martin Luther King Jr. They were out there doing things in society to bring about change. They weren't doing it for people's approval, for popularity, or their opinions. And he says, content is not king. The reason you're doing something, that's the king. That's why you should be doing it. And he's like, you're reducing all of these creative moments to simply TikTok dancing. He's like, don't dance to this. This is a manuscript. In other words, this is my life being poured out in this song. Don't you dare objectify it for another like, another share, another thumbs up. I think it's brilliant. And it's such a self-aware artist to be able to producing really killer art with that sense of truth laced in his lyrics. So I want to kind of wrap up here. I got a few minutes left on this notion of inspiration. Then, what does the word actually mean, right? If we can be inspired by someone and take it in and let it stir us and then freely and authentically create from that, that's awesome. Or we can allow people's influence to dictate how our art looks so we can get likes and shares and maybe contracts and gigs. It's a difference in that freedom. You're kind of working for a system. But if we back up a little bit at this word inspiration, I don't know if you ever looked up the word inspiration or the word inspired, but I love this because this word inspired actually shows up in Genesis, in the original, some of the original translations. In Hebrew, there is ruah, but in Latin it would be inspirare, which means is inspire, right? Inspired literally means to breathe. And the word we see it in scripture is when God creates man, it says that God breathed his life into man. Man's life is not his own. We aren't a product of our own initiative, our own desires. We didn't create ourselves. God inspires. He gives his breath into man. He literally breathes in man. And it's from the inspiration of God's life that man comes forth and is then able to share in this life and cultivate this life. Inspired means to breathe. And so here as creatives, we have this opportunity, maybe in our solidarity, to then take this breath that God has given us and to let it move us into what we're creating. And so I kind of want to ask you that. What is God breathing in your life right now? I think right now there's a great pressure to be super, super proactively creative and flaunt it on social media. Well, it's quarantine. You better pick up a new hobby and a new this and start a job. And that's all great if you are, that's fine. But I think that pressure should be weighed against what is God doing in our heart? Because maybe some people are really joyful right now, but if they make joyful art, maybe people are like, what don't you know there's a pandemic going on? How dare you? Or maybe someone is just really, really desolate right now, really hurting and aching and fearful. And yet there's a pressure to not be such a Debbie Downer, so create something a little bit more even kill, right? But I think true art comes from a true sense of knowing what God is doing, what he's breathing in you right now. And that takes contemplation and prayer and meditation. It takes us sitting down and say, God, what are you stirring in me? I'm afraid right now of the circumstance. God, why am I afraid? Go deeper with me. Wait, I'm afraid because I don't trust you. I don't trust you because maybe I don't believe you're actually the God who provides when this world says you won't. Then maybe you start letting those kind of real raw emotions lead you to create. Maybe like some of my, like, I think most authentic creative moments are filled with a lot of words that I can't share with you now. And they're between me and God and my calligraphy journal, because it's just him moving in me. And this is how I'm expressing my fear or my brokenness or whatever it may be. And I think there's something very authentic about that as artists that we're allowed to do. But let's go a little bit further. Inspired means in breathe. What happens then when we allow God to breathe into us? When we allow him to stir up things in us that maybe aren't popular with society, that maybe aren't trending with the hashtags, but maybe are real and authentic. What if we actually let God stir it up and begin to work and cultivate our craft from that place in that moment? There's two other words I want to share with you. The two words are perspire and transpire. Inspire means to in-breathe. Perspire and transpire mean to breathe out, or to breathe through, or to pass through breath. But I want to look at this. Perspire. When do you perspire? Usually when you're working hard. Usually when you're sacrificing something of you in that moment. And perspire is what perspire actually means is when the breath, your breath, passes through your pores through sweat. Transpire is your breath that evaporates into the atmosphere and the world around you. Now, I don't know if I'm going too far with this analogy, but I want you to think about this for a second. God breathes in you inspiration. And when you and I say yes to that inspiration and begin to work in that mess, in that authentic rawness of where we are in that moment, that is a work. That is difficult. It is bloody. It is tiring. It is consuming, but it causes us to sweat. It literally takes the breath of God and puts it into motion and action through our craft. We wrestle with it. We struggle with it. We have pain and agony in our creation, and we see the sweat of God's breath pouring through us. But when we do that, what does sweat do? Sweat changes you. Sweat burns calories. Sweat gets you into shape. Sweat allows your body to regulate its temperature. See, when we say yes to the breath of God, it changes us. It converts us. It changes us into who he wants us to be, into the creatives he calls us to be. But here's the beautiful thing. Transpire is the evaporation of that sweat. Transpire is how the breath of God passes through us and then enters the atmosphere or the world around us. Transpire is when we say yes to the inspiration of God and we work through it. What God does in us, our art, our creativity, will actually change the world around us as a result. If you go to a gym, you know that the air around that gym is not like it should be, because all those sweaty bodies are perspiring, and that perspiration is evaporating or transpiring and changing the air that you're now breathing. And that's disgusting to think about it, but what if that was good? What if that was truth? What if that was holiness? That you were perspiring, and that was what the world was receiving when they looked at your art. The world didn't just look at your art and say, cool, thumbs up, I like it, I share it because it looks like everyone else's art. But the world stops and says, man, your art challenges me. Man, your work is coming from a place of freedom and vulnerability, and that actually moves me. Think about it in our own lives. What art moves you? Art that is a copycat, that is a mimic, that is done for likes and shares and follows, or art that bucks the trends and says, this is rawness, I want you to interact with it. For me, it's that. It's the messy, it's the brutal, it's the authentic and honest art that actually inspires me. When we're inspired by God and we work with God, we perspire with God, we then transpire and we become inspiration to the rest of the world in their own movement with God. We have a powerful role as Catholics, as Christians, as creatives. And all it starts with is us saying yes to the breath of God and wrestling with the messiness that is our craft. Don't take the easy route. Struggle through it, perspire through it, and watch it change you, and by virtue of that, change the world around you. Strive to create from the inspiration God gives you and not for the approval of Instagram or Facebook or whatever it may be and the people around you. I don't know if that makes sense. If it doesn't, you are welcome to just ignore this, end the call, go run a lap, or I don't know, hop on Pinterest or something like that. But if it does move you, I just encourage you to think about it and pray about it. God is a creative God, and you are made in his image. You have no choice but to be creative. Your only choice is to ignore it or not. I love y'all. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.